Excellent. So yes, a warm welcome to you all. Good morning or good afternoon or good evening to some of you. My name is Toby Lechitzenden. I am the network co-lead at WEAll. And really, we have our WEAll talks every single month. It's a platform for us in order for our members to share knowledge. We have quite a broad membership, intentionally so, because we believe in plurality of thought. And so we're really wanting to hear from the diverse perspectives of our members. And today is an opportunity to do just that. We have John, who is one of our members, who is going to be sharing on the topic, how can we hack electoral processes for global justice? And to give you a little bit of an intro to John, I know he'll be sharing this as well, but he founded the International Simultaneous Policy Organization, which we call Simpol for short, in 2002 to encourage citizens to use their national right to vote to drive politicians, parties and governments towards global cooperation. And since they've started, Simpol has successfully built, somebody's sending me a message. Sorry, some notification popped up there. But Simpol's been successfully building a network of citizens and supporters in over 100 countries, as well as politicians too. He, John, has co-authored and authored 3 books, including People-Centered Global Governance, Making It Happen, and he's also lectured on global governance at the Schumacher Society, as well as the World Trade Organization and the World Academy of Arts and Sciences. So that is just a short intro. I'm sure John is going to give you a lot more interesting updates as he gets into his presentation. He will be doing around a 30-minute presentation, and then we'll have the rest of the hour to engage and ask questions. We know this topic is a juicy one. There's mixed opinions. And so, yeah, we're really excited for the Q&A at the end to hear your thoughts and perspectives, but also for John to give you his view on them as well. Great. I'll hand over to you, John. So I will ask you to share your screen because I know you are doing a presentation, and I'll spotlight you for everyone so you are seen.
Okay, can you hear me all right? Hello?
Yes, we can.
You can. Okay, good. Well, thank you to WEAll, and thank you WEAll for inviting me, and thank you everybody for coming to listen to this. So I hope what I have to say will be reasonably interesting and interesting to you. So how can we hack electoral processes for global justice? Well, before we look at that, maybe we could just have a recap or on how we are doing as a movement. If we look back over the last 50 years, you know, I would say we've tried all sorts of, and are trying all sorts of methods to make some kind of impact on the neoliberal corporate economy that we're suffering from. And we're protesting, petitioning, direct action, party politics, legal action, you name it, we're trying it. But I think we have to admit that after 50 years, none of this is really having the kind of impact that we would really all like to see. So my question really is there something critical that we're just not understanding yet? And my suggestion is that there is. And it's a dynamic that I call destructive global competition. And it's depicted quite well, I think, in this little cartoon image here. If you imagine that these 2 runners, and there are probably plenty more behind them, are national governments. And if they are required to solve a global problem, be it climate change or be it wealth inequality, inevitably that means that they must tighten their regulations, raise taxes on business in order to solve those problems. But any government that does that in advance, or much in advance of other governments, is going to harm its economy, because business costs will rise from the new taxes and regulations. And that will mean that either those businesses will go out of business or they'll just move their operations to some other country. So what you see here in this little image is the government that wins the race to cut emissions actually cuts his own throat because it is harming its economy. And the second runner here has got his finger in his mouth and he's thinking, oh God, I don't want to go there either. Okay, so we have this global vicious circle that I'm calling destructive global competition. And what it really means is that no nation can act much in advance of others. It's a vicious circle. And this dynamic is really what's stopping governments from taking the kind of action that we would like them to see, that we would like to see. And let me give you some examples of this, because you can see examples of destructive global competition in the newspapers. Here's a few clips that I've selected for you. So on the subject of climate change, governments remain reluctant to address this threat because any country acting alone to curb its greenhouse gas emissions without similar commitments by other governments risks damaging the competitiveness of its industries. Okay. If we look at corporate regulation or taxation, it's a similar story. Governments vying to attract inward investment are weighing the advantages of cutting business costs. Tax rates have been falling across the world over the past quarter of a century. This trend is forcing some experts to the conclusion that governments have embarked on a race to the bottom. If we look at, say, unfair trade and sweatshops, it's again a similar story. The £25 suit, but at what cost? Asda, part of Walmart, is today offering customers a passable two-piece suit for the price of a round of drinks in a London bar. Bangladeshi student Shafiqul Islam said, people can't survive on £12 a month, but if the government protests, Asda and others will go to China or somewhere else. Okay, so there's this dilemma. Governments, because capital and investment move easily across national borders, are global, and because governments need to attract capital and investment in order to have thriving economies, they have to compete. And the only way they can compete with each other is to cut regulations, cut taxes on business, cut environmental protections and so forth. Or at least they can't increase them any more than their competitors. So if you imagine a vintage car going down the motorway in the slow lane, that's the rate of progress governments can regulate at in order to solve global problems. But what we don't see is the sports car tearing down the fast lane, which is the rate at which global problems are worsening. Okay, so there's this fundamental dilemma between governments having to stay competitive and global environmental and social justice. You can have one or you can have the other, but you can't have both. And there's lots of issues that are affected by destructive global competition. You can't re-regulate financial markets. Any government that tried to do it alone would only see business investment go somewhere else. Climate, I've already mentioned. Nuclear disarmament is the classic one. No nation can really reduce its arsenal of nuclear weapons unless other nuclear states do so as well. Wealth inequality, it's a similar story. Because governments can't tax the rich and the corporations because they're afraid of them moving elsewhere, the inequality wealth gap between rich and poor, of course, rises and keeps on rising. Tax avoidance and tax competition is another one. Mass migration, you might say, well, what's that got to do with it? Well, because destructive global competition forces this ever-widening gap between rich and poor, of course, the poor are not going to sit still. They're going to migrate to the better-off countries. So this destructive global competition, or DGC, as I call it, is driving all of these issues. Vaccine nationalism, we just saw during the pandemic, is another example of nations competing destructively to get their hands on vaccines. And if we are to regulate the internet appropriately, again, that can only be done transnationally. No individual government can do it alone without incurring a disadvantage. And of course, regulating artificial intelligence would be another one. So that's why I've chosen our friend the Godfather here to embody destructive global competition, because it's like destructive global competition. It's like a puppet. It's like a puppeteer that is controlling the whole thing. It's not that governments don't want to act, but it's that they can't act. So they've got to keep their economies internationally competitive. And what does that mean? It has huge political consequences, this, because what it means is that our votes have become effectively meaningless. Why? Because if you think about it, whichever party we elect, whether it's a green party, a yellow party, a red party, whatever it is, once they get into power, they have to keep the country's national economy internationally competitive. And that means the range of policies that they're restricted to are the same old business-friendly policies that favor the rich and the corporations and disfavor ordinary people and the environment. So whoever we elect, the policies end up being much the same. And this is what I call pseudo-democracy. We have free and fair elections, but it doesn't really matter, because it's a bit like Henry Ford. When he came out with his Model T Ford, the first mass-produced car, he said, you can have any color you like so long as it's black. So that the black was the only color. And it's a little bit the same with our voting at the moment. At least as far as global issues are concerned, our votes have become pretty much meaningless. And that's why nothing is changing. And the result of that, of course, is political polarization. People sense that their votes have become meaningless. And so they resort to the extremes. They either go to the far left or to the far right. And then you have this dreadful political polarization that you see right across the West. And that's the point. It's a transnational phenomenon. Why is it happening transnationally? Why? Because it is coming from a global phenomenon, and that phenomenon is destructive global competition. So the takeaway really is that it's not that governments don't want to solve global problems, that they can't. The real problem we've got to solve is destructive global competition. Excuse me, let me just take a drink. Now, some people think, with the war in Ukraine and so forth, that globalization is over. There's going to be a sort of a re-onshoring of business and industry. It's going to no longer go to China. It's going to come back to the West. But if it does, that will only be temporary. As soon as the war is over, business as usual will resume. And globalization is really here to stay. The internet is not going anywhere. Things are only going to get worse. And so you have destructive global competition on one side, which is resulting from the free movement of capital globally, but you have governance on the other side, which was represented by nation states, which is only national. So you have a global phenomenon versus only national governance. And that governance gap is really what is fueling the current crisis, and it's preventing governments from actually taking the action we need. So the question really is, if the economy that we're living in is global, we need to globalize politics. How do we globalize politics? That's the question. Now, before I go into Simpol, let me just give you a broad overview of the idea behind it. If we look at the way we conventionally vote, that's what you see on the screen now. On election day, we citizens have to choose between the different parties. So they divide us by the different our different party preferences. Okay? The idea behind Simpol is different, and it works not on election day, but before election day. It works between election day. So you still have your parties and you have us citizens, but instead of us just simply choosing between the parties, what we are doing is we are saying we are creating our own global policy agenda. It's called Simpol, and we are going to make you politicians and parties compete to adopt it. Okay, so it acts as a kind of pre-selection. As you as citizens, or all our supporters, as Simpol supporters, are basically saying to politicians that we will give strong preference to politicians or parties who have signed the pledge to implement Simpol. And so that forces them to compete with each other to actually support Simpol. So we use competition to unite them. So I think what I'm trying to explain here, and this is why a lot of people find Simpol quite hard to understand, is because it's a complete reversal of the energy from a standard election day, that, you know, conventional voting where we choose between the political parties on election day, and the Simpol approach where we have our own policy and we then force the political parties to adopt it if they want the best chance of getting our vote. So it acts as a kind of pre-selection tool. So what is the simultaneous policy in detail? There are really three aspects to Simpol. One is the policy, one is the pledge, and one is the process. And I'll just quickly cover each of those three. So first, what is it as a policy? So firstly, it's called the simultaneous policy. Why? Because it's to be implemented by all or sufficient nations simultaneously on the same date. Because if all or sufficient nations act together, implement together on the same date, we all win. No nation would suffer a competitive disadvantage because all would be moving together. Corporations wouldn't have anywhere to run or hide because it would be all or sufficient nations acting together. And the point of that is that that would then break DGC's vicious circle. Okay, so that's the point. But that's not all. The other aspect of Simpol is that it's a multi-issue policy framework. One of the problems with the COP process and other international negotiations on global problems is that they only deal with one issue at a time, like carbon emissions. But the problem with that is that, you know, whenever you have a single issue, there will always be some nations that win, others that lose. And of course, the loser nations then have no incentive to cooperate. And that's why no action is happening. But with Simpol, what we are suggesting is that you would marry two issues together so that what a nation loses on one issue, it can gain on another. So, for example, if you brought together a carbon emissions climate agreement on the one side, but with a global financial transactions tax on the other, the proceeds from the tax could be used to compensate the big losers on the climate part of the agreement. So the idea is that by bringing two or more issues together, you create opportunities for trade-offs, which then have the possibility to make immediate action in every nation's self-interest. Now, the other thing that people are quite nervous about with global ideas like this is they think, oh, it means a one-size-fits-all, monolithic, you know, one-size-fits-all for everybody around the planet. But that's not the case. The way we foresee Simpol is that it would be a little bit like aggressive taxation in an individual country, where the rich pay more, the poor pay less or nothing at all. So there's a graduated approach according to each nation's ability and needs. So it wouldn't be a one-size-fits-all. It also wouldn't be about targets, but about actual detailed policies. Part of the problem with today's global negotiations is they're usually all about targets. But the problem is that no nation knows what every other nation is actually going to do to meet the target. And therefore, because there is that lack of transparency, the fear of becoming uncompetitive is still very real. DGC is still running the show, and that's why nothing much happens. So with Simpol, we'd be talking about detailed policies, not just targets. And most importantly, the simultaneous policy, its policy content wouldn't be decided by me or by politicians. It would be decided by our supporters, Simpol supporters around the world. So it's very much a bottom-up program. So that the overall idea of Simpol is, rather than sort of using moral arguments to bludgeon governments into saving the planet because it's the moral and right thing to do, what Simpol is designed to do is to make cooperation in every nation's self-interest. It's a way of designing cooperation in such a way that nations actually, it's in their actual interests to act now. So moving on to the pledge, what is the pledge that we're asking politicians, political parties, and eventually governments to sign? Well, here it is. I mean, it's actually a one-page document, but it's here in a nutshell. It is, I pledge to implement Simpol simultaneously alongside other governments when all or sufficient nations have also signed and when the policy content of Simpol has been agreed. Okay, so that is very much a pledge in principle, and deliberately so, because a pledge in principle is no risk for politicians, and it builds international trust and confidence. Also, when politicians sign the pledge, they sign it for life. Okay, pledge doesn't need to be signed with each new election. Once a politician or party or government signs it, it is in force across, it transcends electoral cycles. So, the pledge lives on from election to election. And so the support builds and builds and builds. It doesn't have to start from zero at each new election. And like I say, it's a way of getting everybody into the room. It's like politicians, governments, and political parties saying, I'm ready to implement the simultaneous policy if and when you are. I will if you will. Okay, it's a way of actually bringing everybody together, but also an element of challenge. As more and more politicians, governments, and parties sign up, there's a challenge on the remainder to do the same. Now the process. Now this is the really interesting bit, because this is where we citizens come in. Okay. So when you as a citizen sign on to Simpol, which takes just a couple of minutes and it's completely free of charge, we send a little message, a little email to your member of parliament, or in the run-up to an election, to the different candidates who are standing in your electoral area. And we tell them that you will be giving strong preference at all future national elections to politicians or parties who've signed Simpol pledge. Okay. So this, as I've said, turbocharges the competition between politicians and parties. Because if you look at it from their point of view, if I put myself into the shoes of a politician, I would be saying, well, God, there's all these growing number of voters in my area who've signed on to Simpol, who are going to be giving preference to candidates that have signed the pledge. So if I sign it as a politician, I get the benefit of, those extra votes potentially, or I make myself more eligible, more attractive to Simpol supporters. But it's an advantage because I don't actually have to implement Simpol until all or sufficient nations are on board. So that's another win. It doesn't put me in conflict with my current party policy because there's nothing to implement yet. But if I don't sign the pledge, but my competitor or my competitors sign, I could lose my seat, right? So this is a way of turbocharging competition between politicians to get them to sign the pledge. And what we find is that this often creates a kind of domino effect. And I'll this in a bit more detail in a moment, because when one candidate signs up, what you find is then the others are kind of forced to follow. And in a number of times on a number of elections, we've had a situation where nearly all the competing candidates in a particular area have signed the pledge. So regardless of who wins the election, Simpol wins another member of parliament, a pledged member of parliament. So it's a sort of completely new way of doing politics. Now, many politicians have signed up because of this electoral pressure that I've been talking about. But some of them have actually signed up because they see Simpol as just plain common sense. You know, one or two members of parliament have actually signed up just on the strength of one constituent having written to them, because then they look at Simpol, they understand the problem that governments are in, this destructive global competition problem, and they almost say thank you for coming up with something that solves our problem. Now, you might think, yeah, politicians will sign anything just to get your vote, and then after the election, they'll cancel their pledge. But think about it. Simpol doesn't get implemented until all the sufficient nations are on board. And so there is no advantage to a politician to cancel his pledge at any point until implementation arrives. So any politician that cancelled his pledge would just be shooting himself in the foot. He'd effectively be saying to all the Simpol supporters in his constituency or his electoral area, you can't trust me, please don't ever vote for me again. So there is absolutely no interest for a politician to cancel his pledge, and indeed there would be a strong disincentive for him or her to do so. And indeed no politician ever has, so far at least. Okay, so let me come back to the domino effect. What you're seeing on the screen here is a screenshot from our UK website when we were running the general election in the UK in 2017. And what you see here is the Vale of Clwyd, which was a very marginal constituency in North Wales. And you can see here on the 14th of May, the Liberal Democrat candidate signed the pledge, right? What we then did is we sent a nice little email to his competitors telling them that one of the candidates has signed the pledge. Why put yourself at a competitive disadvantage? You know, we have all our Simpol supporters in your constituency who are going to be giving strong preference to politicians who've signed the pledge. Sure enough, a few days later, the Labour candidate signed up, Chris Ruane, on the 19th of May. And then the sitting member of parliament, the James Davies, the Conservative MP, finally cracked on the night before the election, because he didn't want to lose out, because it's, again, a particularly marginal constituency. We never tell politicians how many of our supporters we have in their areas, so we keep them guessing, right? So this is an enormously powerful way of doing politics that drives politicians through competition to actually get them behind a global cooperation program. So what have our results been so far? Well, in the UK, the last election, 2019, over 700 candidates signed the pledge from all political parties. And of those now, over 100 are pledged members of parliament sitting in Westminster today. In Germany in 2021, 50 candidates signed the pledge, 40 are now members of the Deutsche Bundestag. In Ireland, 2017, 53 candidates signed, 11 are now in the Irish Dáil. And we have some MPs in the European Parliament, Australia, Luxembourg, and one or two other places as well. So the UK, you could say, is really, spearheading the process, but other countries are beginning to follow suit. And so we're hoping that this will kind of roll out across more and more democratic countries. Which, of course, brings us to the question, what about the non-democratic countries? How are we going to get them involved? Because, of course, we can't do any of this without China and without other non-democratic countries. Well, first thing to remember is that they need solutions to global problems too. And the way we envisage this is that we would get Simpol rolling in democratic countries first. And then if it's successful and builds and starts to become a much more accepted and credible means of solving global problems, then non-democratic countries can voluntarily join the process. And of course, the win-win framework, the multi-issue framework that I described to you means that no nation has anything to lose by joining the process and everything to gain, because after all, we all need solutions to these issues. And I think another advantage of Simpol is that it comes from a neutral third position. It doesn't come from any national government. It's not tainted by the hidden hand of national self-interest. It's a proposal or a process that comes from us citizens, global citizens. So it's coming from a kind of neutral position. Also, the other question of, you say all or sufficient nations, John. What does that mean? What does sufficient nations mean? Well, sufficient nations means as many nations as is necessary for those nations to feel comfortable about implementing the policy without fear that they'll be undermined by free riders or rogue nations. And I think if you can get enough nations on board, there will be ways to isolate rogue nations to ensure, not to punish them, but to ensure that they can't undermine the implementation of Simpol and its aims and effects. So what does all this mean for you and your organization? Well, really, what I'm trying to suggest really is that we need to use the right tool for the right job. And what I'm suggesting to you is that each global justice organization around the world needs to differentiate your policy demands. Okay, and some of your if you make a list, if you made a list of all your policy demands, all the things you would like governments to do or the government to do, and then ask yourself the question, which of these could be implemented by a government on its own without harming its economic competitiveness, and which of these demands, if implemented by a government alone, would harm its economic competitiveness. And then you're differentiating your demands into two pots. So one is unilateral policies, which can be implemented by individual governments on their own, and for which you can carry on using the usual methods that you employ of lobbying and so on. And the other pot would be the simultaneous policies, the policies that can only be implemented by nations acting together. And for that, you could use the Simpol tool. So it's a way of using the right campaigning tool for the right job. Now, Simpol actually, this is something I started quite a long time ago. We've got a very small team. We're all volunteers. It's all terribly informal. But as I think I've shown, we've actually achieved some pretty encouraging results. And what I would like to see, this is not something that Simpol can run on its own. What I would like to see is that it should actually be taken over by a global coalition of NGOs to really run the thing properly and make it the tool of the global justice movement in as far as those simultaneous type policies are concerned. But that remains to be seen. So maybe WEAll might be, there's an invitation for WEAll there to maybe take that offer up. And in that way, NGOs around the world, organizations like yourselves, can contribute their ideas for simultaneous policies to the process and encourage all your many thousands of supporters to sign on as individuals, to actually build the pressure and keep the number of politicians signing on going up and up and up. Because I think we need to remember politicians can ignore protest, they can ignore most of the other methodologies that we've been using over the last 50 years, but they can't ignore our votes. And so this is really the opportunity, I would say, that Simpol offers. My book here is The Simpol Solution. I would recommend it. I know Simon is here, Simon Tysler. I know Simon's read the book, so maybe he can say something about that if he wants. And all otherwise, I just have to say thank you very much. And of course, please sign on. Anyway, so thank you very much indeed for listening.
Thank you, John. Really appreciate that. And please do share the links in the chat if you can, the book that you mentioned, the website link, etc. But yeah, see clapping hands. Thank you for the support. I already see questions coming in via the Q&A functionality, but also just wanted to put it out there that this is the time to engage on this topic. I know that John has shared this with me many a time, and I'm still digesting and processing a lot of it. So I think, yeah, if you have questions, wanting to clarify anything, just like things that you're not comfortable with, whatever it may be, and things you're excited about, please do share your comments, your thoughts, your feedback. So giving you the space to think, and you can just pop up your hand if you want to share verbally, but I do want to share the one that is in the chat. Well, it's in the Q&A at the moment. So it says, John, thanks for your intriguing work. This is Phoebe. What do you feel are the remaining biggest risks? Doesn't one of the strengths, and then in brackets, of not implementing until or most nations or the leaders sign on, also create too high of a risk of self-disincentivizing failure of action with a vicious backlash of rogue actors?
Whoa.
So you can read that in the chat just to process it. And Phoebe, please feel free to elaborate, because if you are still here.
I think what one has, I think if I'm understanding you correctly, Phoebe, what one has to realize is that we are already in that situation now. Destructive global competition means that nations cannot act now. So we are already in that situation of nobody really being able to act. This sort of vicious circle of inaction, let's say. And the whole point of Simpol is that is that if we act together, that dislodges that inaction, because nobody loses out. If we all move together, no nation's competitiveness would suffer, because all nations are moving together. Corporations wouldn't have anywhere to run. They couldn't exploit one nation off against another, because all nations would be moving together. So it's actually liberates nations from the straitjacket that they're currently held in. Does that? I don't know if that answers your question.
Can I just add to that?
Of course, of course.
We've had a century or more of increasingly globalized capitalism based on competition. It doesn't switch in people's mindsets overnight. And of course, each country has elaborate policy frameworks and trade regimes and financial mechanisms set up to perpetuate that. So I was really specifically inquiring about the caveat that nothing has to happen until enough people have signed on. It's on the one hand, I feel that COP28 is really driving people to recognize how fossilized and dysfunctional our global regime is. On the other hand, there are definitely enough people and there's enough wealth that I think creates a strong disincentive to change, so that people will use that caveat of waiting on implementation as an
understand now.
The way money is possible.
Yeah, now I see what you're saying now. Yeah, so what I would say, Phoebe, is that Simpol is not actually saying that nothing can be done until everybody moves together. There are some things that can be done. So for example, you could say, well, I don't know, sort of 10 to 20% could be done unilaterally by nations and, through the COP process or whatever. But if we're talking about an 80% cut in emissions, that is something that probably won't happen unless all the sufficient nations move together. So I'm not saying nothing happens until Simpol happens. What I'm saying is that all of these other processes will, of course, carry on in the meantime. So Simpol isn't an excuse for inaction. It actually works in parallel to what's happening now. The more they can do now, the better. But what I'm saying is that for the really large strides that will be needed, I cannot see how those could possibly happen without simultaneous implementation. So it's not an either or, it's really a both and approach.
Yeah, got it. That's helpful. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So another one in the chat by Oliver. Oliver, please feel free to share, otherwise I can read it so long.
Can you read it?
Perfect. It says, how are policy goals and multi-issue policy packages proposed or considered and promoted by Simpol?
Okay. Yeah. Well, what I would suggest, if you go onto our website, there's a download called the Information Pack, and that gives a lot more details on how Simpol we envisage it being organized in each country, and also on how we envisage the policies being developed. So that would give you more of an answer to that question. I hesitate to go into detail now. I suppose briefly, what we're looking first to run the campaign to get pledges up to a certain level before we worry about the policy content, because until you've got sufficient political support behind the idea, there's really no point in talking about policies. Another reason for waiting is that the world is changing. And if we were to define policies today, they might not be appropriate by the time something like Simpol or something similar actually got implemented. And finally, of course, if policies were decided today, they would, that wouldn't be democratic, because people joining the campaign tomorrow and in future months and years wouldn't get a say. So, we are purposely delaying policy development because of those reasons. But what we envisage when the time comes would be a two-stage process. So first, each national association of Simpol supporters would develop its own desires for what the policy content of Simpol should be, because the supporters in say the UK may have a completely different view of global priorities to, say, supporters in Kenya or in Indonesia or somewhere else. So there needs to be an independent national process where those desires and needs can be expressed. And then in a second stage, there would be a global negotiation between all the national Simpol groups in democratic countries, and in addition with those governments of non-democratic countries that had joined the process, hopefully by then. So that would be the broad outline. But again, this is put in much more detail in the information pack. And also, I would say it's just a suggestion of how we see this unfolding. I think there could be all sorts of ways that we could marry this with citizens' assemblies, for example, that are already developing in different countries. So there are lots of different options for organizing policy development. And what I would like to see is the whole citizen assembly process kind of integrating with Simpol in some way if that were possible.
I see Oliver's put in the chat that he appreciates that response. Simon, so you've got your hand up.
Thanks, WEAll, and great to see you, John. I read the book a while ago, but still intrigued by every time I listen to you presenting this, and still challenged by the level of ambition of moving from some nation states to a global scenario. And I'm wondering whether there isn't a sort of you started talking now about a 2 stages, and I'm wondering whether we have more targeted approach at where the power really is, and not looking at the UN system, which is completely dysfunctional and or challenged by its dysfunctionality, looking at new groupings that could be either regional or also global. The G21, for example, where 80% of the global population, 80% of the global GDP, and a more sort of targeted and focused strategy towards that geopolitical dynamic, whether that might be a way forward, or some of the regional groupings that, Europe would be an example where and maybe that's why Britain got out, because it meant having environmental and social standards and things like that. But the sort of European approach in other regions. So I'm thinking Africa Union, I'm thinking Latin America, regional integration as a possible building block of trying to shift the way globalization is currently governed.
Yes, I mean, I completely, we don't have to go global in one go. We could, as you say, for certain policies, depending on which issues we're talking about, one could go for a more restricted group of nations like the EU or the G20. But either way, we've got to do it through the vote, so that we citizens are in control. So it's us that determine the policy content, not the G20 with all their corporate lobbyists sitting around them. So I think the key thing about Simpol is it's a way of us using our votes to put us back in the driving seat, rather than hoping that politicians or the G20 will sort of solve this for us. But I do agree with you, rather than going sort of for the whole world, which, as you say, is you cart me off to the hospital, for the mental hospital, if you like, would be more sensible to go to be more targeted. So yes, I'm perfectly open to that approach as well.
Thank you. And I see Lynn Brooks had a similar kind of comment or question. Lynn, I don't know if you'd like to elaborate, but it just said, thanks, John, possibly an opportunity for decentralized technology application to bolster governance and drive implementation. So I think very much in the same stream of what Simon mentioned. But I'll give an opportunity to Lynn, if they're still here, to elaborate. Or maybe they think their answer has been given already.
Hi, thanks. Yes, really just bringing the technology side into the picture, and particularly when it's from the user's viewpoint, us. I think we're going to have to look to technological help, if you will. So I really enjoyed what you've had to say, John. It put things in a much clearer perspective for me, and I look forward to following more closely. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn.
Great, thanks. And then I see another one from Marina. I don't know if you want to elaborate, Marina. It's a longer question, but I can read it so long. Or would you like to read it?
I can read it. It's actually 2 questions. Let me just
yeah, I see.
So one of them, first of all, thank you so much. I've haven't really heard that much about Simpol, so super interesting initiative. And my first question is on getting the votes in countries where vote buying and other illegal practices are still very prevalent, and even like borderline illegal, sketchy, persuasive methods of getting the votes are the norm, and how that factors in, because it feels like when you were talking about the candidates not wanting to pull back on the pledge, that has a certain visibility, but as a citizen, like signing it and not necessarily voting for the candidate that has signed the pledge for Simpol seems more doable and less of a personal risk when there are these other factors in place. And then the second question is about global competitiveness, and not an expert on it, but reading a bit of some of Mazzucato's work, where she shows that a lot of this fear of losing competitiveness is actually quite irrational. Like, you could have stronger regulation in many of these policies and not really lose any competitiveness, but we do operate mostly based on still like rational worldviews and propaganda that really position countries in this endless competition. So just wondering, in the effort of like giving visibility and to this data of things that can be done now without losing competitiveness, whilst also preparing for that future coordination or action, how does Simpol position itself with regards to things that we could be doing without losing any competitiveness?
Right. Okay, thank you, Marina. There's a couple of good questions. On the vote buying thing, well, just before we get into that, let me just clarify that when you sign up to Simpol as a citizen, you're not giving your vote to Simpol. What you're doing, you can still ultimately vote exactly as you please, right? What you're doing is you're telling politicians that they're going to be much more likely to get your vote if they've signed the Simpol pledge. Okay, so if they sign it, it still doesn't guarantee that they'll get your vote. It just makes it more likely that they'll get your vote, right? So that's the first point to make. I mean, as far as vote buying, countries where that's concerned, to be honest, Marina, I don't really have an answer to you. I don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that cooperation tends to happen, when the water gets up to here, right? When things get bad enough, it becomes in the interests even of those who we may feel to be our enemies today to cooperate, because if they don't, they're going to be finished as well. So I think one has to see Simpol as a kind of evolving process against the backdrop of global problems getting worse and worse, and therefore the pressure for cooperation starting to overwhelm even those people who we might today consider to be the enemies of it. In terms of the competitiveness thing, I completely understand what you're saying. Often the competitiveness argument is used as a kind of scare tactic by business groups. It's, oh God, this will harm our competitors. And in some cases, it's true. It wouldn't have any real effect, and governments probably could go ahead. But I would say two things. One is that you've got to remember that governments have got to legislate for everybody in the country, for all businesses, right? So it's very difficult for them to sort of pick out, this thing could be done without harming our competitors. This thing might not be. Their overall concern is to show their country as a business-friendly, capital investment-friendly destination. So it's more that sort of higher level that it's working at. The other thing I would say is that, if you've got a world where capital is moving globally, freely and globally, and you've got national governments that need that capital in order to have thriving economies, of course you're going to get competition, It's like, how could it be otherwise, right? So I think whilst there are certain issues where it is a ruse, and governments probably could go ahead, that doesn't negate the fact that more broadly, in terms of certainly the bigger strides that need to be made on climate and so forth, they can't really do it. So like I said to Phoebe, I think it's, Simpol isn't sort of saying that nothing can be done until everybody acts together. That many things can be done, and we should where we feel that. I mean, really, what I'm saying to the global justice movement is we need to fight with both hands, with both tools in our hands. So rather than just saying, oh no, governments should just go ahead. If the corporations threaten to leave, let them leave, which of course governments won't act. We should push as far as we can with that tool, but we should also push with the Simpol tool, right? We can do both rather than just one or the other. Does that kind of answer? Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Brilliant questions and also really great responses, John. Thank you. I see Rebecca had a comment. Just quickly want to mention it in the chat because I resonate with her as an ordinary person coming into this. She just mentioned here that there's such a diversity of values and principles. How can policies reflect these? Surely it will be just a hub of continuing conflict and argument because of this diversity. Governments seldom act in our interests, and what would be different, particularly whilst the focus is based on capitalist ideas. She says this from just a cynical standpoint in these times.
So different values. Yeah. Okay. So first of all, can I come to the second bit of that? The whole point of Simpol is that us citizens decide the policies, not governments. Okay. So we're not. The whole point is that we are in the policy driving seat, not the governments. Because they depend on our votes, they have to do what we tell them to do if there's enough of us in supporting Simpol. So that's the first point. Second point about values, really, really good point, and thank you for making it. Now, most of the things that different cultures disagree about are not issues that have an impact on national economic competitiveness. So things like, I don't know, abortion, capital punishment, I don't know, a lot of these other issues tend to be issues that can be decided at a national level. They don't need to be decided globally. And so those issues, the whole point about Simpol also is that it is, because of this, what I call this differentiation between unilateral policies and simultaneous policies, Simpol only deals with policies that can't be implemented by any nation alone. And therefore, all of those kind of cross-cultural conflicts tend to be outside the purview of Simpol anyhow, right? They don't even come into the picture. So if somebody says, we should have abolish capital punishment globally, we apply what we call the subsidiarity criterion. Would the unilateral implementation of an abolition of capital punishment by a single nation cause it an economic competitive disadvantage? Yes or no? Well, obviously the answer is no. Doesn't get included in Simpol. It doesn't even come into the negotiation. So a whole load of, these very contentious cross-value issues would be excluded right from the start. There's another slide I wanted to actually show you, which I cut out because of time. But I think to that question, it's one of my favorite slides, actually, because if you look at what the left is looking for, what are we looking for? We're looking for environmental sustainability. We're looking for far less wealth inequality. We're looking for good social safety nets and government services, and we're looking for peace and security in a nutshell. Okay, what is the right looking for? The right is looking for secure national cultural identity, less immigration, They're looking for continued economic competitiveness and also peace and security, right? We could say in very broad terms. Well, if you know, Simpol, the whole point about Simpol is it reconciles those two polarities. Because if something like Simpol were implemented, you would immediately internalize all of the economic externalities. You could regulate to ensure that those, all the negative fallouts, like carbon emissions of our globalized economy, were internalized. So that would answer the environmental sustainability thing. But it's also to be implemented by all sufficient nations simultaneously, so that no one's competitiveness is unduly harmed. Okay, nobody loses out to any other. So that satisfies the demands of people on the right. Okay, every nation's economic competitiveness, their relative competitiveness would stay the same. Okay, so that satisfies that. Then, because we'd be able to tax the multinational corporations, the Metas and the Twitters and so forth properly, and some of those funds could be redistributed to developing countries, that would allow those countries to develop viable, thriving economies, and that would reduce the pressure to migrate. That would mean that national cultural identities would be safeguarded for every country. Another key demand of the right. So you see what I mean? These a Simpol world would actually start to reunite, to reconcile some of these polarities that are tearing us apart at the national level now.
Thanks, John.
Does that make any sense?
It does. And I would love you to perhaps share your details. I saw there's more comments in the chat, but we definitely won't be able to get to it now since we are 6 minutes over. But it was so juicy. I think this is the thing. I think more people would want to engage with you and ask questions and be able to see some of the other slides you're mentioning as well. So please do share your details if you can in the chat.
Yeah, sure.
But a huge thank you to you, John. I think you were really good at just like clearly articulating this. Even for me, I really appreciated your slides and the clarity. It's the first time I really just started to understand this model. And it really just, we are in such desperate need for big models of disruption. And I think, positive disruption, I think this is one of them. So I really appreciate that. And I just want to say to everybody else here, thank you so much for joining. These happen on a monthly basis. They're called WEAll Talks. If you're not part of our community, please email me if you would like to be a member, torbili@weall.org. But either way, you'll still get updates, and we'll always share the upcoming WEAll Talks. So the next one is taking place in February by Derek Hamilton from the New School in New York, speaking on human rights and the economy. So watch this space. More information will follow. But if we don't see you till then, we're wishing you the most amazing holiday season ahead.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, Tabil, and thank you everybody for showing up. Really appreciate it. And do contact me if you have any further questions or thoughts or suggestions. It's very much something that we need people to get involved in. I don't have all the answers. We need to kind of solve these problems together as we go along. But I think there's the kernel of something that really could make a big difference if we can get enough people behind it. But thank you anyhow.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
See you next time. Thank you.